5 days. The sound of the tractor did not necessarily mean that Mr. Fitzgibbon was getting ready to plow. He used it for many other things, hauling hay and firewood, for instance, and moving, and clearing snow in the winter. Mrs. Frisby reminded herself of all of this, and she hurried over to the corner post. That was a very thick fence post at the corner of the garden nearest the farmhouse and the tractor shed. She had discovered long ago that it had, a few inches above the ground, a convenient knot hole with a hollow place behind it in which she could hide when she had a reason to, and watch what was going on in the yard. The cat, Dragon, also knew of its existence, so she had to look sharply when she came out. She came up carefully behind the post, stared this way and that, and then darted around it and up into the hole. All clear. Mr. Fitzgibbon had backed the tractor out of the big, cluttered shed where he kept it. Leaving the motor idling, he climbed down from the seat and called to the house. In a moment, his older son Paul came out, closing the door carefully behind him. Paul, at 15, was quiet, a hard-working boy, rather clumsy in his movements, but strong and careful about his chores. In a few seconds, he was followed by his younger brother Billy, who, at age 12, was noisier and had an annoying habit of skimming rocks across the grass at anything that moved. Mrs. Frisby did not much care for Billy. "All right, boys," said Mr. Fitzgibbon. "Let's haul it out and see about the linchpin." "It was just about worn through last fall, I remember," Paul said. The boys disappeared into the shed, and Mr. Fitzgibbon remounted the tractor. He turned it around and backed it slowly toward the shed, so that the rear end was out of Mrs. Frisby's sight. There was some clanking and clanging inside the shed while Mr. Fitzgibbon, looking around over his shoulder, worked some levers on the side of the tractor. All set. He shifted gears and eased the tractor forward again. Hitched behind it, clear off the ground, was the plow. Mrs. Frisby's heart sank. Surely he was not going to start now. But as he had the plow out in the sunlight, Mr. Fitzgibbon turned the tractor's engine off. It died with a sputter, and they all gathered around the plow hitch. "Sure enough," said Mr. Fitzgibbon, "she's just about ready to shear. Paul, I'm glad you remembered that. If I order it today, Henderson's will have a new one in 3 or 4 days." "It took 5 days last time," Paul said. "5 then. That's just about right anyway. It's too wet to plow now, but 5 days like this ought to dry the ground out. Let's grease up while we've got it out. Billy, get the grease gun." In her hiding place, Mrs. Frisby breathed a sigh of relief, and then began to worry again immediately. 5 days, although a respite was too short. 3 weeks, Mr. Agus had said, would be the soonest Timothy could get out of bed, the soonest he could live through a chill night without getting pneumonia again. She sighed and felt like weeping. If only the summer house were as warm as the cinder block's house. But it was not, and even if it were, he could not make the long journey. They might try to carry him, but what's the use of that? Only have him get sick again after one night there. She might, she thought, go back to Mr. Agus and see if he had any ideas that would help. Was there some medicine that would make Timothy get strong sooner? She doubted it. Surely, if he had such medicine, he would have given it to her the first time. She was thinking about this when she climbed out through the knothole and slithered to the ground below, not 10 feet from the cat. Dragon lay stretched out in the sunlight, but he was not asleep. His head was up and his yellow eyes were open, staring in her direction. She gasped in terror and whirled around the fence post to put it between her and him. Then, without pausing, she set out on a dash across the garden as fast as she could run, expecting at any instant to hear the cat scream and feel his great claws on her back. She reached the shoe's hole and considered for a fraction of a second diving into it, but it was too small. Then she glanced back over her shoulder and saw an amazing sight. The cat had not moved at all. He was lying exactly as before, except that now one of his eyes was closed. The other, however, was still looking straight at her. So, she did not pause, but raced on. Finally, when she was safe distance now, 2/3 across the garden and nearly home, she stopped and looked again more carefully. The cat still lay there and seemed to have gone to sleep. That was odd and so unheard of. She could hardly believe it. Feeling quite safe but puzzled, she looked for a vantage point from which she could see better. By rights, she should be dead. And though she had escaped what seemed almost a miracle, she scolded herself for having been so careless. If the cat had killed her, who would take care of the children? She saw a dead asparagus plant, stiff, tall, with branches like a small tree. She climbed it and from near top looked back at the farmyard. Mr. Fitzgibbon and his sons had finished greasing the tractor and gone somewhere else. But the cat still lay on the grass, seemingly asleep. Why had he not chased her? Was it possible that, close as she had been, he had not seen her? She could not believe that. The only explanation she could think of was that he had just finished a very large meal and was feeling so stuffed and so lazy he did not want to take the trouble to get up. But that was almost unbelievable. Certainly it had never happened before. Was it possible that he was sick? Then, on what had already been a day of oddities and alarms, she noticed something else strange. Beyond the cat, quite far behind, between the barn and the house, she saw what looked like a troop of dark gray figures marching in columns. Marching? Not exactly, but moving slowly and all in line. They were rats. There were a dozen of them, and at first she could not quite see what they were up to. Then she saw something moving between them and behind them. It looked like a thick piece of rope, a long piece, maybe 20 feet. No, it was stiffer than rope. It was electric cable, the heavy, black kind used for outdoor wiring and strung on telephone poles. The rats were hauling it laboriously through the grass, inching it along in the direction of a very large, wild rose bush in the far corner of the yard. Mrs. Frisby quickly guessed where they were taking it, though she could not guess why. In that rose bush, concealed and protected by dense tangles of fiercely sharp thorns, was the entrance to a rat hole. All the animals knew about it and were careful to stay away. But what would the rats want with such a long piece of wire? Mrs. Frisby could not imagine. Even more curious, how did they dare pull it across the yard in broad daylight when the cat was right there? The rats were bigger than Mrs. Frisby and could be, when necessary, dangerous fighters. But they were no match for Dragon. She watched them for quite a long time. It was obvious that they knew exactly what they were doing, and they looked as well drilled as a group of soldiers. They had about 25 yards to go to reach the rosebush, as if at a signal, which, however, she was too far away to hear, they would pull together, moving the wire about a foot. Then they would pause, rest, and heave again. It was about 20 minutes before the first rat disappeared into the bush. A little later, the last bit of wire disappeared behind them like a thin black snake, and Mrs. Frisby climbed down from the asparagus bush. All that time, the cat had slept on. In your opinion, what was strange about the cat dragon's behavior? What exactly was he doing that was odd to Mrs. Frisby as she made her way back to her home? Another question is, what were the rats pulling? Please use text evidence when you discuss this with your class and your teacher.